So let's talk about student loans.
Student loan.
Federal student loan. With student loan.
On student loans.
Student loans.
Student loans.
Student loans have grown rapidly over the past few decades, and there aren't any signs of it slowing down. Since 2006, the national student loan debt has more than tripled from $520 billion in 2006 to $1.78 trillion in 2024. While the number of federal student borrowers has jumped from 28 million in 2007 to over 42 million in 2024. And the average federal loan balance per borrower has jumped from 18,000 to over 39,000 in that same time. For a lot of people, student loans are starting to get out of hand, postponing major life milestones like owning a home, getting married, or starting a family. It's even gotten so bad that roughly 6 million borrowers are 60 days or more late on their payments. That's 1 out of every 7 borrowers. And if you just go on any social media sites, you can see just the effects of these insane loan amounts.
So as it turns out, the student loans that I've been paying $1,500 a month for 2 years have a 17% interest rate.
Does anybody else with student loans kind of feel like you're being held hostage by the federal government right now?
But it wasn't always like this. In fact, there was once a time where borrowers who felt too under the water with their student loans were actually able to claim bankruptcy and remove this debt they owed. But in 2026, that's no longer the case. Let's talk about why. Bankruptcy is a federal legal process that helps people who can no longer pay their debts get a fresh start by liquidating assets to pay their debts or by creating a repayment plan. And there are 2 main types of bankruptcy for individuals. Chapter 7, which essentially makes you sell all of your assets, or Chapter 13, which is basically that you can think of it as a structured payment plan that the government will decide on. And these include all types of debt: mortgages, car loans, boat loans, credit cards, medical bills, every sort of debt and loan that you can think of except one: student loans. Well, prior to 1976, they were included and treated as any other form of debt, but something changed. In the late 60s and early 70s, some chatter started to occur among journalists and legislators pointing out the fact that our bankruptcy laws were pretty old. I mean, the Bankruptcy Act was created in 1898 and nothing had really changed for 70 years. And now we had new consumer items like the creation of the modern credit card, the amount of auto loans had boomed, and we were seeing for the first time multiple years in a row of runaway inflation. There was a lot of fear in the air for another Great Depression, and on top of that, Vietnam was also happening and public opinion had started to shift against the war. So a lot of panic was happening and some changes needed to occur. So President Nixon, alongside Congress, established the Commission of the Bankruptcy Laws of the United States in 1970. They were created to study and recommend reforms to the aged federal bankruptcy law. This team of 9 members had 3 that were appointed by the president, then 2 more were each appointed by the Chief Justice, President of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House.
Actually, can we take a quick moment to appreciate that they actually followed the separations of power here?
That's just unheard of today. Maybe take notes, Biden and Trump, instead of just throwing whoever you want into positions they shouldn't be in.
Rest now, brother. We have the watch, and I'll see you in Valhalla.
Anyways, I digress.
They worked for about 3 years and created this report in 1973 called the Report of the Commission on the Bankruptcy Laws of the United States.
I know, such a great creative name for this report.
In this document, they talked about some good concerns like further clarifying different types of bankruptcies and expanding federal jurisdiction. But what they also included was this graph stating that debts from student loans should be non-dischargeable, which when you look at this graph isn't really a desirable outcome, but it's also not really an undesirable one either. And that was kind of it for a little bit. The group was disbanded after all this was published in July of 1973, and Congress just kind of stewed on the information for a bit, at least until 1976, when Congress passed the Higher Education Amendment of 1976, which stated that in order for student loans to be discharged through bankruptcy, they had to wait at least 5 years after the beginning of the repayment period, or they can discharge via the undue hardship route. And this was only further cemented through the same time when Congress decided to commission an additional study by the Government Accountability Office on the subject of guaranteed student loan program bankruptcies. And in 1978, when the Bankruptcy Reform Act was finally signed into effect after 8 long years, it was included in here as well, putting the final nail in the coffin for restrictions on student loan bankruptcies, or so we thought. This only applied to federal loans, but in 1984, the Bankruptcy Amendments and Federal Judgeship Act of 1984 removed the word "of higher education," inferring that now this 5-year limit also includes student loans from private institutions, allowing loans from corporations like College Ave or SoFi to be included in this restriction as well. But that wasn't it, because in September of 1987, a recent master's graduate by the name of Marie Bruner filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, saying her now $9,000 in student loans were causing her undue hardship. which at the time was probably true because she didn't have a job. But she had also only graduated 10 months prior to this court case, and she initially filed for the discharge in less than a month after the first payment of her loans came due. This was the exact abuse of the bankruptcy system that legislators and journalists have brought up almost 20 years prior. So her loan debtor, the New York State Higher Education Service Corporation, appealed, and they won. But Miss Bruner wasn't going to give up that easy, so she appealed to the second court. And this is where they realized and said, hey, I think there really isn't a definition of undue hardship. It's really just kind of left up to interpretation. We should really define this a little bit better, but also keep it a little vague because, you know, law. So they adopted a 3-part test to determine undue hardship. The first test being the debtor cannot maintain, based on current income and expenses, a minimal standard of living for herself and her dependents if forced to repay the loans. The second test being there must be additional circumstances that exist indicating that the state of affairs is likely to persist for a significant portion of the repayment period of the student loans. And the final test is that the debtor has made good faith efforts to repay the loans. 3 vague rules to allow for the law's favor area. Gray area.
And what makes it even more difficult is not that you prove one of these or prove 2, you have to be able to prove that all 3 of these apply for you to get your student loans discharged. Oh, and get this, the definition of what a minimal standard of living is pretty strict.
Because if you can afford regular home bills like cable, or you can afford to pay your addiction like buying cigarettes, which is one of the most addictive products ever invented, or even things like your 401k contributions, could deter you from passing this first test.
There's an entire deep dive of these undue hardship cases that have occurred over the past 30 years, and a lot of them are really wild. There was one in particular that really caught my eye, and I won't get into it here.
But basically, it was an older gentleman who was legally blind, and him and his wife combined were making $3,190 per month, and he had over $67,000 in student loans.
And keep in mind, he was 58 and blind, and yet the U.S. Department of Education still didn't want to discharge his loans. If you're interested in just seeing how far they'll take it in passing these 3 tests, I'll throw a link down in the description below, but man, was that one crazy.
Side note, there's also this test called the totality of the circumstances test that's a little bit more lenient, but only really in the 1st and 8th circuits. So unless you live in Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Puerto Rico. Oh, in any of these states, if you live here, you may have an easier time discharging your loans, but don't hold your breath.
That's freaking me out. What is she doing?
Anyways, after this Bruner test was established in 1987, they still weren't done. So in 1990, the 5-year restriction on discharging your student loans was extended to 7 years, and it was introduced in the Crime Control Act of all things, which seems a little weird. Like, I get fraud is crime, but this bill was covering things like expanding the federal death penalty, creating mandatory penalties for certain crimes, and more anti-drug laws. If you ask me, it seems like some senator just sneaked this in the bill and hoped nobody would find it because none of them probably knew how to use Control F. Thank you, George H.W. Then after that, literally a year later, they removed the statute of limitations on collections of defaulted student loans.
So yes, I can take out a student loan and proceed to beat up a random kid on the first day of school, and then just never go back to class or pay my student loans, and then after 5 years, that kid decides to sue me for assault. He can't, but the government can still come after me for that $250 student loan that I took out to go to that class.
And then in 1998, they officially made it to where your 7-year restriction no longer applied, and student loans became the only loan not to be able to be discharged through bankruptcy. And they put the final nail in the coffin in 2005 when all forms of student loans were now exempt from bankruptcy.
So why? Why would they go from imposing slight restrictions on when you can discharge student loans to all the way to being stuck with them forever? Well, we have a few theories and possibilities as to why.
The first one being obviously to deter fraud and exploitation. I mean, we see this in the case of Marie Bruner, that what she was doing looked a lot like attempting to exploit the system. And one of the original major concerns is that high salary individuals like doctors and lawyers were going to get their education and then declare bankruptcy before starting their careers so they could get all of that skill for the small inconvenience of having a bad credit for a few years, which is a completely justifiable worry. You might be able to take someone's degree credentials away, but you can't unteach someone. This isn't Men in Black where you can just erase someone's memory. It could also be for a little bit more strategic reasons, like for military recruiting. One of the best perks and benefits for joining the greatest fighting force the world has ever seen.
Sorry, I got a little carried away there. And a lot of people joined to get access to the GI Bill. I mean, it wasn't the reason I joined, but it sure as hell didn't hurt getting it as well.
Free college or paying off student loan debt is one of the biggest selling points that recruiters use when talking to recent high school and college graduates, and it's like what Senator Jim Banks from Indiana tweeted. Student loan forgiveness undermines one of our military's greatest recruitment tools at a time of dangerously low enlistments. If people can just discharge their loans, a decent portion of our military recruits would never actually join. Another reason could be to encourage public service positions. Professions like public Public school teachers, police officers, public defenders, nonprofit social workers, charity administrators, and more like these all qualify for student loan forgiveness after 10 years or 120 qualifying payments have been made, incentivizing people to switch to more community-focused roles instead of going to those for-profit companies. Now, these next two are getting into the more of the conspiracy side of things, but I promise there is some ground to these claims. The first one being that the reason this happened is because universities push for this. There is no sound evidence, but I mean, it goes back to that first commission in 1970. Members on that team had ties to universities like UCLA and NYU. Now, I'm not saying that was their goal, but there may have been some conflict of interest here. If you think about it, if your students are essentially getting blank checks in the form of loans from the federal government, why wouldn't you increase your tuition every year? If you know that their payments are guaranteed and backed by the US government, you will always feel fine charging whatever price you want. If you look at the average tuition price growth compared to basically any other metric, it blows them completely out of the water. I mean, let's look at the growth of tuition and other school fees versus inflation since 1980. It's almost grown 3 times as much. And now let's look at the average cost of tuition versus the median salary. You can see that from 2000 to 2019, the real median household income has gone up by less than 16% since then, which is actually horrible to think about because that's less than an average increase of 1% per year.
I may do a whole deep dive to why that is in the future, so if you're interested, leave a comment down below.
But look at this, in that same time, college tuition has grown over 83%. That's more than 5 times more. The reasons are because there just aren't any legal or physical downsides to these universities charging more and more for tuition. They don't care that you graduate with a useless degree and $100,000 in debt. They just care that you paid them to do it. And lastly, the reason for this, and knowing that we know about lobbyists and PACs, I can highly see this being the main factor, is because private institutions and banks push for this. If you can give out a loan that's 100% backed by the government and almost impossible to get out of, you're going to take that deal any day of the week, because now you don't have to do any risk assessments, which lower costs. You don't have to do any underwriting for the loan like you do for every other loan, which also saves costs, and you can give out insane loans that some people will never be able to pay off, basically giving yourself income for the life of that person. From the perspective of a bank, all of these feel like great laws and regulations. So now we understand the history of all this and the possible reasons as to why. Is there anything that can be done about this? Well, yes, and these are in order of least likely to ever occur to most likely to occur. The first one being is that legislation could be passed to allow student loan forgiveness. This one is the most unlikely of ever happening, mainly due to a few issues that were increasingly pointing out during Biden's attempt at this a few years ago. The first being it could completely tank the economy. There's currently almost $1.8 trillion in national student loan debt, and completely wiping this could lead to a surge in spending, further increasing the current inflation problem we're already dealing with. And on top of that, there will be a large amount of public outrage by the individuals who paid their way through college, paid off student loans, or didn't even go to college, which would not work out well for whichever party passes this. And lastly, it doesn't fix the bigger issue of increased tuition or enormous student loans. All this would do is wipe everyone clean now, but 20 years down the road, we'd be in the exact same situation with probably even more debt than we have now. So we look to option number 2, which could be that legislation could be passed to allow student loan bankruptcy again.
I personally believe there shouldn't be an issue with this, especially with after the grace period of 7 years.
The average college grad will be almost 30 at that time, and a lot of them will have gained some assets, either in the form of home, car, stocks, or other aspects. So I don't see a huge percentage of the population willing to throw away 7 years worth of money gained and saved, especially because your credit score could be atrocious after this, causing things like home ownership to be pushed further down the line than it already is. However, I'm sure there will be some pushback for this regardless because of worries about fraud and exploitation. So we can move on to solution number 3, and that is legislation that could be passed to restrict tuition growth. Tuition costs have gotten out of hand, and there needs to be some form of restriction put on it, at least until inflation or the median income are able to catch up. But as a graduate who studied economics, I know this can lead to all sorts of market inefficiencies. If professor salaries growth aren't set, they may start to look elsewhere, leading to reduced quality of education, and this could lead to less research due to budget pressures from universities. And it would ultimately probably just shift costs to other areas, like instead of paying a majority of your money to tuition, you now get to pay all of the fees like parking lot fees, library study time fees, Wi-Fi fees, etc. There's a million ways to charge students that aren't necessarily tuition. So that leads us to our last solution, which is legislation could be passed to cap loan amounts by degree type. There is no reason that an art education major going to Valley City State University in North Dakota should be allowed to get the same loan as an engineering student at Harvard. Loan amounts should be determined by the estimated and reasonable income someone can expect to make within their degree, but this still allows for those big loans for students studying law or medicine. But it starts to restrict student loans for areas of study that will ultimately lead to more modest income.
So what do we know? We know that student loans used to be eligible for bankruptcy, and we know that this all started in 1970 when a committee was established and they determined that this was too risky and that they should be restricted from bankruptcy. We know college is one of the top strategies to recruit for the military and public positions, and that universities are incentivized to allow this to keep happening since tuition can keep growing indefinitely, which is great for them. And we know that banks and financial institutions are incentivized because they have a government-backed guaranteed loan that can never be bankrupt. So do I have some kumbaya at the end of this video telling you it's all going to be okay? Not really. It's more important that we bring awareness to this issue because this can't go on forever and it will inevitably crumble at some point. If tuition continues to grow, the younger generation or the one after them will realize at some point that the return on investment on college really isn't worth it anymore, and they will start to choose alternative routes. But if people believe college is the only route to be successful and their parents and teachers keep emphasizing it, more and more people will end up in these debt holes that they will just never be able to get out of. Hey, listen, I know it got kind of grim there at the end of the video, but if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like this, I do ask you guys please like, subscribe, and drop a comment down below and hit the notification bell so you can see when my next upload is. I'm currently working full-time, so I don't know if I'll be able to get a video out every week, but I'm trying my best. So until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.